more, and no surprise to anybody, but there's some specifics that I'd like to talk about that really give some evidence of that some of you may be familiar with. But Kansas was a very nice place, and I'm not going to recap all the changes that have happened since since we got away from Kansas, the mergers, the acquisitions, investor attitudes. I'm just going to focus on a single point, and that really is probably the most important point to you all, and that is your clients have changed. Advisors have changed. They have voluntarily or involuntarily moved to different firms. Some of them have a different investment philosophy. A lot of them have a different attitude toward asset allocation. Some of them have changed their target client profile. And I think probably universally, all of them have made less money, which causes them to react in a variety of different ways. Here's a couple of the stats, which are interesting, from the Discovery database. Some of you may have heard this before, but in terms of advisors moving, you see the press and you think, oh my God, they're all going to be breakaway brokers. They're moving to the independent firms. And that actually, as of yet, has not come to be actually the truth. There are about 6,000 advisors who have moved over the last 6 months, and the surprise is that about 4,000 of them have moved to another wire. And so I guess the point here is that some of the data is different from some of the assumptions, which then impacts your strategy. In terms of money moving, 2,000 of those moving advisors control an aggregate of $200 billion. Now, the implication for that is really the importance of firms having the intelligence to identify where those advisors are and where that money is going. Advisors now are more segmented, and that means they have very different support needs, some of which don't align to assumptions about channels, for those of you that are channelized, much more niched advisors with specialties that really don't mesh with the generalist wholesaling approach of the past. So basically the summary there is that distribution organizations and their wholesalers can't possibly remain unchanged. And just like the folks in the picture there, wholesalers are going to need to step out of their, and some have already obviously, step out of their comfort zone, and the strengths that they had in the past may not serve them well in the future. Now, if you layer on top of all this the reality of the storm damage that for some firms was, crucial to survival, based on our conversations with dozens of asset managers, we looked at one of the big categories of the storm damage. And here we go. You look at the 4 leverage points in selling to advisors. We got internals, we got sales desk managers, we got externals, we got value adds. Internals got hit the hardest. Some direct cuts, in many cases an inability to fill a lot of open spots. And quite frankly, for every wholesaler layoff in the press, there was at least one internal who quietly lost their job. And based on our surveys and the folks that we talked to, on average, smaller firms lost at least somewhere between 5 and 7 internal positions, and the larger firms at least 10, sometimes more. The American Funds, for example, shut down a whole facility. And we all know, and we have in the past, how important it is to stay in front of advisors, right? So look at the math here. In terms of the reach of your organization to reach advisors, if you assume that each internal has 15 good conversations a day, that's just a very conservative assumption. And say you lose 10 internals. That's 750 conversations a week or 15,000 conversations a month that are not happening as a consequence of internal wholesaler cuts. And that's kind of a big number of advisor contacts. So the implications also on those who remain on the internal wholesaling side is, it's 1 step back or 3 steps back, back to 2-to-1 coverage, a real hit to motivation. Here I am back to juggling 2 strong personalities of wholesalers who need even more support, and they're worried about their job. And so that's a tough situation in terms of the quality of conversations that are able to go out that we're able to go out before. The other unfortunate victim of the crisis, and this is a very big deal, the team leaders. Typically, there were a couple of team leaders that helped the sales desk managers. You had a span of control of somewhere between 8 and 10 internal wholesalers. Now what we see virtually across the board is team leaders have been knocked out, and what remains is a sales desk manager that is trying to manage sometimes 30 people.
I just spoke to one a couple days ago, and he'd never had great infrastructure. He'd only had kind of player coaches. He now has 25 people reporting directly to him.
No way you can coach that number. No way you can coach that number. You can basically just keep things as under control as possible. And this is the time where they need the coaching the most because they're different conversations. And on the external side, their issue is that, you saw the cuts. They have more people to see, larger territories in many cases, and the difference in the conversation now has to do with much more hand-holding. It is not the conversation of the past. And I guess the question that we ask the organizations that we talk to is, were your wholesalers able to get to the right people, or were they able to get mostly to the people they know in an effort to hang on to what they had? And finally, on the value-add side, I have to do this. I have to start with the death of the motivational speaker, which from our perspective might not have been a big deal, but there are huge investments that have been made in developing value adds, as you guys know, and the budgets have been slashed on the marketing side as well. And the reality is much of what has been out there has passed its expiration date. And, for example, practice management, not because it wasn't good, but just because it's not on the priority list right now.
Right, the glories of asset allocation and how to explain to your clients how asset allocation will help them stay safe in the storm.
But let me move on to it not being, wasn't all that bad. A couple of things just jumped out. On the retirement side, there was, the importance of that market clearly broke through. In mid to large size firms, it wasn't unusual for there to be an additional 20 wholesalers, externals, internals, management. Firms staffed up. And the implication of that for you folks in the managed solutions industry, well, I'm going to say this delicately. If that's where the resources are going, the doubling of wholesaler teams, senior management, while we haven't run the numbers, it looks to us like the fun business has dominated these programs. So that's all I'm going to say about that. On the hybrid side, and of course we could talk about, we've done a ton of research on this, we could talk all day about it, but we're not going to. We'll just highlight that there have been some failures, but several real success stories, especially for those who have figured out that hybrids are not just junior wholesalers or high-powered internals. Their function is unique and needs to be supported that way. The interesting thing, and some of you may have heard this, is that many hybrids during this storm delivered the same sales results or even more as some of the externals out in the field with lower value advisors. It's not a knock on external wholesalers. It is a reality that if you spend less time in the field, you can reach more advisors. And one of the things is that, in terms of the folks that did it really well, is they looked at the things in terms of lessons learned, like how much a well-thought-out hybrid program, needs to have something as simple as, how do they introduce themselves? Do they say, I can't get to see you as much because everybody's cutting back? An excuse-driven conversation? So anyway, there were some great successes.